Welcome to the Power of Purity podcast, the show that empowers men to experience their sexual gift in a healthier way. Now here's your host, Tony Ingracia.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Power of Purity podcast. I'm so thankful that you are able to listen to today's episode, and I do pray that it will be a blessing and an encouragement to you. And I'm just going to go ahead and jump right into today's episode. And I want to start by just mentioning that if you've been following me, you know that the past 2 weeks I did a little series of episodes that was entitled With or Without Your Wife. And that was episodes 238 and 239 of the Power of Purity podcast. And in this series, With or Without Your Wife, I focused on and talked about how it's our responsibility as Christian men to be men of purity, with or without the help that we would prefer from our wives. And this episode today is intended to be a kind of continuation of the ideas that I was sharing with you in those 2 previous episodes. And maybe, said another way, today's episode is actually intended to be a kind of disclaimer in the shadow of those past 2 episodes. Because I will tell you that there's something about the past 2 episodes and what I was teaching in those 2 episodes that really kind of bothers me. And I have this sense that something doesn't feel quite right. Kind of like, when you have a pebble in your shoe and you're trying to walk around and you can feel this thing just enough that it's kind of bothering you, but you're not sure that it's that big of a deal, and is it really worth the time to actually sit down and go through the trouble of actually taking off your shoe, then putting it back on, just to try to get rid of this little thing that's kind of bothering you. So it's kind of like that, because there's something that's kind of bugging me about what I was teaching in the last 2 episodes, episodes 238 and 239, and it leaves me feeling kind of like metaphorically there's a pebble in my shoe, and it leaves me feeling like the last 2 episodes aren't really finished, because there's still something that needs to be said that's really important, something that needs to be acknowledged and understood and conveyed. And that's what I'm trying to do in this new little series that I've chosen to entitle Sexual Honesty. And if you listen to those 2 episodes, you know that the primary point that I was teaching is that essentially, as Christian men, we are called to honor God and to honor our wife with the expression of our sexual gift if we're married. And if we aren't married, then as a single Christian man, you're called to honor God and to honor your future wife with the expression of your sexual gift. And if you've been following the Power of Purity, and if you've been listening to this podcast for any extended period of time, then you know that there's a kind of theme that emerges through my teaching, which I believe is a very biblical theme, by the way, that can be easily supported by the Bible. And this theme concerns the idea of sexual exclusivity, which I would advocate is at the very heart of God's will, design, and plan for both human sexuality and marriage. And this idea of sexual exclusivity essentially means that God intends for us to express and experience our sexual gift exclusively within the context of our marriage and exclusively with our spouse. And when I say exclusively, you guys, I think you know what I mean. I'm talking about absolutely 100% without exception exclusively with our spouse, which means that I will never ever express my sexual gift apart from my spouse, which means that my body belongs to my spouse, my penis, my orgasm if I'm a man, my vagina and my orgasm if I'm a woman, that the expression of my sexual gift belongs exclusively within the context of my marriage relationship with my spouse, which means I will never express my sexual gift apart from my spouse, which means I can't look at porn by myself, because that would be taking out my sexual gift and expressing it apart from my spouse. It means that I can't masturbate by myself, because I would be expressing my sexual gift apart from my spouse. It means I can't have an affair. I can't go to a strip club. And on it goes. Because I am committed to this concept that emerges from my understanding, based upon the Bible, of God's mind and heart when it comes to sex, of God's will and plan and purpose and destiny for sex, human sexuality, which, again, at the epicenter of God's intention is sexual exclusivity. It means that your sexual interest as a person and your sexual desire and passion and expression and experience belongs with your spouse. Absolutely, 100%, without exception. And further, I'd affirm that it's this same concept of sexual exclusivity that's at the heart and epicenter of a couple of the primary teachings that I presented through the Power of Purity ministry, which include the teaching that I call wife-size sex and the teaching called the sexual alliance. And I don't want to freak you guys out too much here, and I don't want to confuse this primary message of the teaching that I present through the Power of Purity, because I obviously believe very strongly, and I'm obviously very committed to these ideas of sexual exclusivity and to wife-size sex and to the sexual alliance. And I believe very strongly that these ideas and teachings do accurately represent and convey the essence of God's will, plan, and design for both human sexuality and marriage. But with all that being said, I do think it's very important to bring some further clarification to these ideas, and that this clarification is very important and necessary to establish. And the reason I think it's so important to establish this clarification is because without this clarification, I'm concerned that these teachings of sexual exclusivity and wife-size sex and the sexual alliance might be creating and placing upon some men in certain situations both an unfair and undue burden that will essentially be impossible for them to bear. And I do not want to do that to any person, and I will not do that to any person, and thus the metaphorical pebble in my shoe. In Matthew chapter 23, Jesus spoke of the hypocrisy of the Pharisees, and he said, they tie up heavy, cumbersome loads, and they put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. And that is exactly what I do not want to do through my teaching, because through the Power of Purity, I certainly do not want to tie up heavy and cumbersome loads that are essentially impossible to bear, and then place those impossible burdens on the lives of men and provoke within them any sense of failure or shame when they're then incapable of bearing the impossible load that I've placed upon them through my Power of Purity teaching. And my primary point, you guys, and my primary concern that I'm trying to speak to is this, that through these teachings of sexual exclusivity and wife-size sex and the sexual alliance, and through the teaching that I presented in the last 2 episodes of the podcast, episodes 238 and 239, which were entitled With or Without Your Wife, that I may be placing, in a way, a heavy and cumbersome and impossible load on some men's shoulders because of the reality of the situation that they're confronted with within the context of their marriage. And let me try to explain what it is that I'm so concerned about here. I realize that many men, in many situations in their lives and marriage, are confronted with the reality of profoundly difficult and overwhelming and confusing and hard and maybe even impossible situations. So, for example, what's a man to do if for some reason within the context of their marriage that he and his wife are in a place where they are simply unable or incapable of ever having a sexual relationship, or for some reason their sexual relationship is either non-existent or so irregular that for all practical purposes it almost never happens or happens very infrequently. And I feel like that statement and that question is so important that I'm going to take the time to actually restate the question one more time. What's a man to do if for some reason, within the context of their marriage, that he and his wife are in a place where they are simply unable or incapable of ever having a sexual relationship, or for some reason their sexual relationship is either non-existent or so irregular that for all practical purposes it almost never happens or happens very infrequently? And therefore, if a person is in this situation within the context of their marriage, I'm deeply concerned that the Power of Purity teachings of sexual exclusivity and wife-size sex and the sexual alliance are essentially placing an undue and heavy and cumbersome and impossible burden on this man's shoulders in life. Because I'm basically teaching him that he should never, ever express his sexual gift apart from his wife. Yet at the same time, he's in a situation in his life, for whatever reasons, that he essentially has virtually no sexual access to his wife, or at least very, very limited sexual access to his wife. And therefore, by these teachings, I'm basically asking this man to do something that's virtually impossible to do, or at least very, very difficult to do, because I'm essentially pushing him into a corner and I'm leaving him with virtually no alternatives. And I'm basically asking him to be completely non-sexual or asexual, and I'm basically saying something like this: well, that's your tough luck, dude, because you're only supposed to be sexual and have orgasms with your wife. You're only supposed to express your sexual gift exclusively with your wife, no matter what. So the fact that your wife is not available to you sexually, and the fact that you and your wife almost never have sex, is your tough luck. And it's something you're going to have to deal with, because God only expects you to express your sexuality with your wife. So that means that if you cannot have sex with your wife, then you're just going to have to figure out somehow how to live your life without sex and how to live without orgasms. And you're going to have to basically figure out how to be a non-sexual man. And it's this issue, you guys, that is essentially the pebble in my shoe. It's what's bugging me about what I was teaching in the last 2 episodes, with or without your wife. Because basically I feel like it's completely unfair and unkind and non-understanding and non-empathetic and non-compassionate to say something like this to a person who finds themselves in such a difficult situation that basically they're living in a sexless marriage, or at least a marriage where sexual intimacy either never happens or very infrequently happens. And therefore, in the verbiage of Matthew chapter 26, I feel like by me teaching this to men, it's kind of the equivalent of what Jesus was talking about when he said to the Pharisees, they tie up heavy and cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. And I don't want to do that to any man, and I'm not going to do that to any man. And that's why I've dedicated this episode of the podcast to speak to this issue. So, what's a man to do, for example, if he has virtually no sexual access to his wife? Or if his sexual access to his wife is incredibly limited because for whatever reason sexual activity with his wife almost never ever happens. So, in the way of example, what if a particular man's wife simply has no sexual desire or appetite whatsoever, and she has no interest in sex whatsoever, and she doesn't seem in even the slightest way concerned about her husband's sexual needs or desires. And what if a man's wife wants absolutely nothing to do with sex for literally months and months at a time, if not years at a time? I mean, for real, you guys, I've met many couples who literally do not have sex and have not had sex for years at a time. And when I say years, I mean like maybe 5 years or 6 or 7 or 9 years, or it's been 10 years since they've had sexual intimacy between them within their marriage. Or, in the way of another example, what if a man's wife was sexually abused at some point in her own story, and as a result, she's completely shut down as a sexual person, and she's incapable of functioning sexually as a sexual person, and these issues and struggles have therefore followed her into her marriage, and therefore she's now incapable of responding or participating with her husband sexually in any way within the marriage. Or what if a man's wife is struggling with some other kind of either emotional or psychological or physiological or mental or physical or sexual disability that's so debilitating that she's simply incapable of participating in any kind of sexual activity or sexual relationship with her husband? Or what if there's some other issue or handicap or struggle or liability that for some reason is making it virtually impossible for a married couple to enjoy a sexual relationship with one another within the context of their lives and marriage? Then what is this man to do? And are we expected, therefore, to say to this man, well, I guess that's your tough luck, dude, because God says that you can only have sex with your wife, and God says you can only express your sexual gift with your wife, and God says you can only have orgasms with your wife. So since your wife is not able to do any of these things with you, I guess you're just going to have to live without sex and live without orgasms. And dude, you're just going to have to learn to be non-sexual. And it's basically your tough luck, because you're still expected to be a man of sexual purity. Because Tony taught in episodes 238 and 239 of the Power of Purity podcast, which was entitled With or Without Your Wife, that you have to be a man of sexual purity even if your wife isn't available to you sexually. I guess it's just your tough luck, dude, and you need to figure out how to live without sex. Is this what we're going to say to this man? And what I'm saying to you guys is that I am not going to say something like this to this man, because in the verbiage of what Jesus said in Matthew 26, I think that would be the equivalent of placing a heavy and cumbersome load on this man's life and shoulders that would essentially be impossible for him to bear. And I'm not going to do that, and I don't think that's what God would want us to say to this man, or what God would want us to do to this man. And by the way, I'll offer an example of what I'm trying to speak to here that I happen to be very familiar with, because the example is taken from the life of this guy that I happen to know, and his name is Tony Ingrassia. And if you guys will remember from my story, you'll remember that when God led me into this understanding of sexual exclusivity and wife-size sex, and when God led me to make what I now call my holy vow to God and to my wife, and when God led me to commit the expression of my sexual gift exclusively to my wife, that my wife and I were in a very difficult and dark and broken place at that time in our marriage. And my wife and I were still going to counseling, and we were still in the middle of our therapeutic process, and we were still dealing with all the brokenness of our lives and the hurt and the pain and the darkness that was alive and so powerful in each one of our lives and in our marriage. And I was still dealing with the roots of my sexual addiction, and Sherry was still dealing with the roots of her sexual aversion. And basically, we were a total mess at the time, And because of that, we were very broken and disconnected when it came to sex within our marriage and our relationship. And because of that, guess what, you guys? We were almost never, ever having sexual relations in our marriage, or we were at least having sexual intimacy very infrequently within our marriage. And this went on for years. And by the way, when I talk about that we were never having sex or very infrequently having any kind of sexual intimacy, I mean that we would typically go for months and months at a time between intimate encounters between us, like maybe 3 months, and then something might happen, then it might be 7 months after that, or 5 months, and one time we even went 9 months between any expression of sexual intimacy between us in our marriage. And my point, you guys, is that it was during this time of very limited sexual activity within my marriage that God introduced me and really enlightened me and illuminated me to these concepts of what I'm now calling sexual exclusivity and wife-size sex. And it was at this time when I had no or very limited sexual access to my wife that God was showing me, Tony, your body belongs to your wife. Your sexual gift, your penis, your orgasm belongs to your wife and is intended to be expressed exclusively with your wife. And therefore, you should never, ever express your sexual gift again in any way apart from your wife. So it was at this time, during these really dark and difficult days, when I did not have sexual access to my wife, and my wife and I were being very non-sexual in the context of our marriage, that I entered into what I now call my holy vow, and I entered into my sexual alliance with my wife. And I became determined and committed to never, ever express my sexual gift apart from my wife. But the point I'm getting to from my story, you guys, is this. And I think it's a very important point. And maybe I'll make the point by asking a question. And the question is this. Guess how long I lasted? In other words, I made this commitment to God and this commitment to my wife. I will never express my sexual gift apart from my wife. And my wife and I weren't having sex. So therefore, I tried to wait. And I was determined to not express my sexual self apart from my wife. And therefore, I was not looking at porn. I was not masturbating. I was not flirting with other women. I wasn't going to strip clubs. I wasn't using a prostitute. I wasn't using cyber sex. I wasn't calling 1-900 phone sex numbers. I wasn't doing anything. I'm talking about complete, absolute, 100% sexual abstinence in every way because I was committed and determined to what God was showing me. I will not express my sexual gift in any way apart from my wife. And on the strength of that prayer and that commitment and that determination and that understanding of what God was showing me, this new understanding of sexual exclusivity and wife-size sex, guess how long I lasted? For those that have heard my story, can you remember from my story how long I lasted in my ability to live in complete sexual sobriety and complete sexual abstinence within the context of my marriage? And the short answer, you guys, is that I was able to make it a little over 2 years. And for those 2 years, my wife and I were still going to counseling. And for 2 years, I walked in my holy vow. And for 2 years, I had absolutely no expression of my sexual gift without my wife whatsoever. And for those 2 years, my wife and I were basically almost completely sexually abstinent within our marriage. And then you might remember from my story that for those 2 years, I quite literally lived in physical pain within my body because I had taken authority quite literally over my sexual self and my body, and I had essentially turned myself completely off when it came to sex and orgasms. And as a result, my body didn't know what to do, and it essentially rebelled against me and essentially threw an absolute fit against me. And as a result, much of the time, my testicles literally ached and hurt, and the pain radiated up into my abdomen and stomach. And sometimes it hurt to walk, and it hurt to sit, and it hurt to move about, to the point that my body began to emit streams of sperm when I would urinate, because I think my body was literally confused and overwhelmed and disoriented and simply didn't know what to do with itself when it was suddenly deprived of the opportunity to have a sexual release on a regular basis, as I had trained my body for years and years leading up to that point. But the point I'm getting to, you guys, is this. I only made it for a little over 2 years in my ability to abstain completely from any form of sexual expression whatsoever. I tried so hard to wait for my wife and to wait for the time that she would become sexually available to me. And you might remember from my story, you guys, that it was after 2 years of this profound trial and difficulty in my life of complete sexual abstinence and sobriety that my wife and I actually had a fight one day. And it was during this fight that my wife essentially scorned my holy vow, and she mocked my holy vow, and she told me that she didn't care about my holy vow, and she told me that she was unimpressed by my sexual abstinence, and that in fact she believed that what I was doing was essentially trying to manipulate her with my holy vow, and that my holy vow was nothing more than my attempt to force her to have sex with me. And if you remember, you guys, it was at this point in my story that I simply couldn't take it anymore. And I essentially blew a gasket. And I therefore told my wife that since my holy vow didn't mean anything to her, that I was therefore going to renounce my holy vow. And with that being said, you guys, I see from the clock that my time is up for today's episode of the podcast. So I'm getting to a point here. All of this today in the way of setup to the point that I'm getting to. And if you want to see that point and understand that point with me, the pebble in my shoe, the thing that's bugging me, then you're going to have to come back next week, you guys, for part 2 of this little series here that I'm calling Sexual Honesty. What does a man do when he is confronted with a situation where he has very limited sexual expression or access to his wife? What is a man to do? So come back next week and we will continue right there. I will continue on with my story and try to share with you guys some things I've been struggling with in my heart, in my understanding, this thing that I'm calling the pebble in my shoe, and we will work through this together as we continue to seek God's heart, God's mind, God's will, God's purpose and plan for human sexuality, even for those of us who are married. So I just want to bless you guys in Jesus' name. More than that, I ask for God's blessings over you in Jesus' name. I pray that you have a fantastic week. I pray that you will be filled with the Holy Spirit. I pray that you will be empowered by the Holy Spirit to exercise self-control this week, because we live in a crazy world with a lot of temptation. And I pray that you are strengthened in your inner man to be the man of purity, to exercise your no muscle, and to have the capacity to walk on the narrow path that God has called us to walk as we seek to honor Him and we seek to honor our wife with the expression of our sexual gift. So with that being said, you guys, God bless you. I'll see you right back here next week, and I'll look forward to it. Bye-bye now.
Thanks for listening. Visit powerofpurity.org for more resources and information. And if this podcast has been helpful or encouraging, please invite a friend to listen. Until next time, remember, there's power in purity.